covering the stories that impact your life, your town, your state, and your future. This is The Means Report with your host, Brad Means.
Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to The Means Report. We certainly appreciate you spending part of your day with us, where today we are not trying to be a killjoy here in the holiday season as you eat and drink your fill, but we are going to spend the next 22 minutes or so focusing on weight loss and weight maintenance and your overall health when it comes to how many pounds you should weigh, especially with all of these wonder drugs on the market these days. Everyone, it seems, is getting jabbed. What's the safe way to lose weight and to keep it off? And of course, we'll wrap up this edition of The Means Report, as we always do, with ways that you can stay in touch with us. We want to welcome back Dr. Ron Eaker. Dr. Eaker is board certified in bariatric medicine. He knows weight loss and how to handle it and how to maintain it. We had you on a few months ago, but we needed to have you back, especially this time of year. Thanks for doing it.
Very glad to be back. And you're right, this time of year is the most difficult time of year for weight management. Everything surrounds food, whether it's home or family or church. It's all food oriented, and unfortunately, oftentimes not the best food. But we want folks to be able to enjoy the holidays, to not feel deprived, to feel part of that. And there are ways you can do that, whether it involves medications or not. There are ways you can do that and safely avoid that 5 to 7 pounds of weight gain that the average American will do between October and January.
All right, well, you sparked a question. Let me ask you this before we get started with some of the wonder drugs that we talked about last time and a new one that's come on the market since. You hear people say, well, Thanksgiving doesn't count. Christmas doesn't count. Do you buy into that, where you should give yourself a day or two off every now and then from your diet?
It's all about balance. And the critical thing to understand when we think about dieting is it's not about starting and stopping. It's about a lifestyle. So if you have that vision, if you have that long-term view, little blurps in the road, little potholes every now and then, those are okay. That's life. One of the biggest problems we have with traditional dieting is that it's too restrictive. It's not real world. It's not something that can be maintained. And as we understand more about weight management and understand that it is truly a medical issue, we want to get away from this mindset of starting something and stopping something, which has traditionally been how we viewed diets in the past. Just the word itself implies a beginning and an end. And we really want to get away from that because we're looking at this as being something that's going to be permanent. We really want people to view themselves as not someone who's dieting, but someone who's eating healthy. And it's a subtle change, but it's an important change. So little things like holidays, birthdays, weddings, those are going to happen. And if what you're doing can't be integrated into that, it's not something that's going to last, so it's really not something that's going to be worthwhile doing.
Yeah, so many people will slip on a certain day and say, well, I've slipped, let's go ahead and turn that one day into a week, and then it just builds.
Exactly. Yeah, failure is not a person, it's an event. And I think the only failure that I view is what you just pointed out, is not getting back on that horse and riding into a more successful weight loss.
Dr. Eaker, you said it's a medical issue, so where does willpower come into play? Is that a real thing?
Willpower is real, but I think the myth is that that's the primary guide or primary force behind dieting and weight loss. The reality is it's largely a metabolic problem. I was at a conference just recently and heard one of the world authorities on weight management make a quote that really stuck with me, and said that weight management is not a calorie imbalance, it's a hormone imbalance. And that really drove it home that this is a medical issue related to how energy is taken into the body and how energy goes out of the body. And certainly willpower relates to how much you take in. That plays a bit of a role.
Yeah.
But there are some people out there that are so metabolically disrupted that they could be on bread and water and still gain weight. And the problem arises, and especially a lot with women who I work with a lot, is there's this dynamic between these multiple hormones that can literally control where the energy goes when you take it in. When you eat food, that energy is basically broken down into the nutrients, like the proteins and carbohydrates and fats that people always are familiar with. And the body is such an amazing, miraculous tool that it doesn't make sense that there would be just some random distribution of energy, that it would just happen to hopefully go where it needs to go. That's under very, very tight control by these multitudes of hormones that really regulate not only where that energy goes, but then when you need energy, when you need sugar, when you need fats to supply muscles or your brain, it tells you where to pull that from. You know, we have fat stores. We all see those. We know those. Those are what we don't like.
Sure.
And they're basically storage depots of energy. We also have storage depots in our muscles. So how our body utilizes those is dependent on this balance of 10 or 12 of these hormones that are intimately interacting. Many of those are what people have heard of, things like cortisol and insulin. And that's where some of these new weight loss medicines are game changers, because for the first time, they're actually impacting those hormones and helping to restore that metabolic dysregulation. So when it goes back to what you were saying about willpower, that's about appetite and consumption. Well, these medicines help with that. They help with appetite, they help with satiety, but for the first time, they actually also go to this underlying metabolic dysfunction, which is so key to regulate. That's why they've really become extremely popular, because they work.
So let me just ask you this about willpower to make sure I fully understand. If you stand your ground and you're staring at that pantry and there's cookies and Doritos and all the things that you want, and you deny yourself those things, it doesn't matter, because when you put the next food into your body, whether it's healthy or junk, your metabolic distribution is going to kick in and you have no control over where the energy from that food goes.
To a degree. Now, of course, what you put in and what you eat will influence how that energy is distributed. So it's like if you're bringing in a massive amount of sugar, then that's still sugar, and that sugar has to go somewhere, and that's going to be converted into to body fat and other bad things that happen in the body itself. So what you eat and how much you eat still plays an important role, and that's just one piece of the puzzle. But it's never as simplistic as calories in and calories out. It's much more complex than that, and I think it's where it's been so frustrating for so many people who will feel like they're doing the right thing. Now, sometimes they're just don't have the right information and aren't actually doing the right thing. But if they're truly making an effort and consuming low sugar, low fat, low saturated fat, high fiber, low calorie content, and not seeing a lot of changes happen, it very well could be this metabolic dysfunction. We see a lot in women in things like PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome. We see it with menopausal changes. And in particular, those hormonal shifts can alter how that mixture of hormones influences where that energy goes. So it's a very complex problem, and we never want to oversimplify it by thinking it's just a matter of pushing away from the table. Yes, that's a piece of the puzzle, and the above the neck attention to weight management is vital, and that has to be addressed. It's not just all in a pill or a shot.
All right, I want to talk about these shots and other medicines that are out there when we come back. I want to save the bulk of our time today to discuss those things that we see the commercials for all the time, and certainly we see our friends as we pass them and understand that they're on something and it's working, and we wonder about these things and how sustainable they are. We're going to cover that with Dr. Ron Eaker on the Means Report. Welcome back to the Means Report. We're talking about weight management with board-certified bariatric medicine, Dr. Ron Eaker. I'm so happy that he has come back. A wealth of information always from Dr. Eaker. Let's talk about Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. We talked about those last time. These are the shots people can get. They are using them to lose weight or for diabetes. Zepbound is on the market. So tell me what Zepbound is, recently approved by the FDA, and all 4 of these medicines. Are they for diabetes and we're just kind of borrowing them for our weight loss needs, or was that part of their original intent too?
Yeah, the history of these medicines is very interesting. They've been around 10 or 12 years, and they broadly fall into this category called GLP-1 agonists. And that basically just stands for a particular hormone that's produced by the stomach that increases satiety, it decreases hunger, but it also is one of those hormones that we just mentioned that plays a regulatory role in energy distribution. So these shots initially, these medicines initially came out for diabetes. That was one of their original uses because they're extremely effective at helping get blood sugar under control. And remarkably, unlike a lot of other diabetic medicines, they take you from a high blood sugar to a normal blood sugar, but then don't push you too low. We've all seen people who had too much insulin and they got hypoglycemic, which is a real danger, so you have to regulate insulin very tightly. These don't do that. They help lower the blood sugar. But what they discovered when they first started using this in folks with diabetes is that these people were losing weight. And they weren't sure, well, is it because of the diabetes getting better, or is there something intrinsic in this medication? So they began studying these medicines in non-diabetic folks, and they found that indeed there was a weight loss component, and that's what really launched this whole field of GLP-1 agonists. And currently, the way it's structured is there are 2 categories of medicines. There's the Ozempic and its sister Wegovy. Ozempic is FDA approved for type 2 diabetes. Wegovy is FDA approved for weight management. And those are exactly the same medicines, exactly the same drugs. And then you've got the Mounjaro, and then you've got the new sister of Mounjaro, the Zepbound, where Mounjaro is type 2 diabetes, Zepbound is weight management. And that's a bit of a different molecule. The first and second generations, the Ozempic, the Wegovy, the Saxenda, the kind of the liraglutide and semaglutide, the 2 twins of diabetes, they initially were really there for specifically treating diabetes, but they only hit one of those particular hormones called GLP-1. What's different about the Mounjaro and the new Zepbound is that they actually hit 2 of the different hormones. They do GLP-1 and GIP. Now, what difference does that make? It makes some difference as far as their efficacy, as far as the effectiveness in losing weight and actually controlling blood sugar.
Can your body get used to those? I don't care how many ways they can attack or how many hormones they can handle. Eventually, can't your body go, okay, I see what you're trying to do. I'm going to make you be fat again?
Well, that's a great question, and that's something that's been studied, because when we look at historically the older medicines used for weight management, for example, phentermine or Adipex, which is a very popular one used for years, virtually everybody on that medicine at some point will hit a plateau, where they'll lose weight very rapidly and then plateau. In looking at these studies now, up to 3 or 4 years of these injectable GLP-1 agonists, you do see a drop-off in the rate of loss after about 6 or 8 months. However, the rate loss does continue. So there doesn't seem to be that same adaptation that people had with some of the other weight loss medicines. So we're seeing ongoing studies now looking at it really extending on not only as just a weight loss drug, and this is key, but a weight maintenance drug. That's a complete shift that we never really had in the past. Most drugs that were ever used for weight management were used just during that weight loss phase. But now, as we understand that this truly is a medical issue, and just as we use other medicines for long-term medical issues like hypertension, most of these newer drugs are actually being looked at, probably in a lower dose, as a maintenance drug on the way forward.
Okay, so you may have just answered my next question is, what are the long-term effects? You're saying, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, you can be on these drugs long term and they can manage the effects on your weight.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And the good news with the weight loss aspect of this is we have over a decade worth of data from these drugs because they've been used for diabetes for that length of time.
Are we keeping these drugs, and I asked you this last time, I think, from diabetics because we're all trying to lose so much weight on them? Are there people with diabetes out there going, thanks a lot for taking all my medicine?
That's been a big problem, and that's part of the shortage reason or the reasons are given for the shortage. And many folks who are either trying to get the Wegovy for diabetes for weight loss or the Ozempic for diabetes are actually finding a very difficult time finding certain dosages in pharmacies. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. The companies have not been very open about what those reasons are. I think there's largely problems in some of the supply chain and some of the manufacturing issues. That's what we've heard from our contacts. But yes, you're right that the Ozempic in particular has been used, if we can characterize it as off-label, for people who don't have diabetes, who are just using it for the weight loss.
Who's the gatekeeper? Is it you, the doctor? Is it Congress? Is it the drug maker who says, look, I understand your need to lose weight, but I can't do my diabetic patient wrong by giving you this. I got to hold it for him or her.
Well, there's really, the gatekeeper, believe it or not, is the insurance company. Because what happens is if I write a prescription to somebody for Ozempic with the idea of using it for weight loss, that's perfectly fine. Doctors have done that for years. It's, again, this off-label use. We use a lot of medications that are not specifically FDA approved for that indication.
Sure.
So there's no barrier there. The barrier becomes when that patient then goes to the pharmacy and says, can I get this prescription? And they said, sure, we'll check with your insurance. And if you are not diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, or if you do, and even beyond that, if you don't supply documentation, which we now have to supply in the form of what's called a pre-authorization, the insurance company will say, we're not going to pay for it. And so you're out of pocket $1,300 for the Ozempic or the Wegovy.
Oh.
So that's where the actual barrier becomes.
All right, it's a great answer, and it's helpful to understand how this whole thing works behind the scenes. What if you say at that point, the insurance says, I'm so sorry, you're not pre-authorized, you can't have this, and you say, well, I'll just go down to the compounding pharmacy and they'll make me some. Do people do that?
They do, and that's become a very, very interesting dynamic because of the shortage that's occurred with these medications. Whenever these medicines become less available to meet the demand, the FDA has the ability to put them on what's called the shortage medication list. Mm-hmm. When that happens, it opens the door to compounding pharmacies to allow them to make these medications. They're still under patent, so without that designation, they can't do that. But once that door is open, they can walk through there. Now that opens another set of problems with regards to the safety and the quality. The compounding pharmacies don't have the same kind of restrictions that a lot of the traditional manufacturers have. So there are a number of issues. The biggest with these weight loss medicines is that semaglutide, which is the generic name of the Ozempic and Wegovy, they will not sell that base molecule to U.S. compounding pharmacies. So they have to go elsewhere to get that base molecule. Oftentimes foreign suppliers out of China and India, for example,
that's when you
will supply that.
And there's the gray market.
That becomes a little bit less supervised. Some people would say a lot less supervised and a lot less restricted. One of the biggest problems we're seeing now, and many people may have experienced this, is online they can click on an ad that says get semaglutide or get the equivalent of Ozempic, and sometimes it'll require them to have a doctor televisit with one of their physicians on staff. Sometimes not, even just ordering it yourself. You know, many people have done that from websites based in other countries. And what we have discovered is that's extremely dangerous because many of these suppliers are using what we call the base salts. In other words, they're using the semaglutide, but in the form of a semaglutide sodium or semaglutide acetate, which were the actual medicines used in animal studies. So they're not approved for human use.
But they'll send it right to you.
But that's where the source is.
Scary.
So you've got to be a very critical consumer.
Yeah, I would encourage people to please go to you or their family doctor and figure this out. Don't do it on the computer.
They need to follow up.
What happens when one moment we see our friends and they look one way, and the next time we run into them, they're skeletal? What's happening to their muscles, and what do you advise your patients when it comes to maintaining overall muscle health when you drop all those pounds?
Great question. I'm so glad you brought that up, because especially in the area that I work with a lot of women, we know that they typically are going to lose muscle mass as they age. Plus, when you lose weight, you always lose muscle, fat, and fluid.
Yep.
And we want to maximize fat loss and minimize muscle loss, because muscle is actually associated with longevity. So we want that to stay intact. And there's actually some recent studies that show that on these medications, unless you're careful and maintain adequate protein intake and weight-bearing exercise, that you actually can see some muscle wasting, some muscle loss over and above what we would expect with that large fat loss.
Yep.
So you have to be very intentional about maintaining that exercise and adequate protein. In our dietary instructions, we talk a lot about reducing sugars and carbohydrates, but never do we want to compromise on the protein intake for that exact reason. We want people to maintain that muscle mass, because that's also a key to them maintaining the fat loss. Muscle is the furnace that burns the fat. It's your better butter burners. That's where you get rid of that fat. So if you can maintain that muscle mass, the likelihood of you continuing to maintain the weight after the loss skyrockets.
Well, that's a key point of advice to remember. And again, it all goes back to being supervised by a physician. Dr. Eaker and his colleagues, I'm sure, encourage you to do that. Dr. Eaker, thanks so much. The time has flown once again, but great information today.
Thank you, Brad.
Absolutely. Dr. Ron Eaker, when we come back, how you can help us get more great guests like Dr. Eaker. It's easy for your input to be heard by the powers that be here on the Means Report.